Just a little plug again for our sponsors, the consulting groups, AMC, Gyro, SRK, CSA, Coffee, Maxwell Snowden and Cube. Fantastic support from those groups. It's my pleasure to introduce to you James Rowe, who's with the ASX, and he's looking to explain to you what the changes to the listing rules are and the implications for reporting on the ASX. So please welcome James Rowe.
Thanks for that, Chris. I run the ASX office in Perth, and I'm ASX's representative on the JORC Code. Very heavily involved in the consultation in relation to the new listing rules, and had a bit of a hand in drafting the FAQs, which hopefully Graham has left for me to talk about. Okay, so I want to talk about our the new listing rules. It's if you look at how the JORC Code 2012 works, you can't look at that in isolation. You have to look at that in light of the new listing rules. The two of them sit quite well together, but you need to be across both of them. So it's not you can't just be across the JORC Code. You have to be across the listing rules as well. The previous listing rule just simply said you need to comply with the JORC Code. As you'll hear today, it says a little bit more than that now. So I'll quickly talk about the review and consultation, and I'll go through the new rules, and more importantly, I'll talk about the transition period and what we're seeing to date. So we did 2 rounds of consultation. We received 138 written submissions, and we did 64 roundtables and meetings, and we got submissions from various industry groups. We actually released our report on the feedback we received on the 2nd of April 2012. Makes interesting reading in a historic sense now, because we are where we are. We've already implemented the rules. In essence, the Chapter 5 introduces new reporting requirements for material mining company disclosures. It's underpinned by the JORC Code 2012. It obviously remains principle-based, and we released Guidance Note 31. I encourage you all to read Guidance Note 31, because that explains a number of definitional changes. It gives guidance on the meaning of material project, the meaning of material change. We talk about what we understand, if not why not reporting to be, and we talk about the ways you go about disclosing or not disclosing commercially sensitive information. So when you look at these new rules, many of the requirements, they're triggered by when reporting on material projects. So it's exploration results from material projects, resources reserves for material projects, production targets, etc. So a material mining project is a defined term, and that's one where an entity has an economic interest in the project, and that interest is likely to be material in the context of the overall business operations or financial results of the entity. Again, we'd ask you to look at Guidance Note 31, because we discuss that in greater detail. And we recognise that materiality will change over time. And so when you look at these new rules, you'll see that what we refer to them as the enhanced disclosure rules, they're triggered when talking about material projects, and the trigger points within that are when it's the initial disclosure for the first time, or any material upgrade to what you previously disclosed. So the new reporting requirements cover a number of areas: exploration results, mineral resources or reserves, competent person sign-off, and I'm sure you all want to know about that, historical and foreign estimates, production targets, and cautionary statements, and annual disclosure. So turning to the actual rules themselves, and sorry, I'm flying through this because I know we've got a panel session after, and I tend to ask a lot of questions at the panel sessions. So if looking at exploration results, that's dealt with under Listing Rule 5.7, and it's disclosure of exploration results for material projects. And you're going to start seeing a number of themes developing in the way we structured these rules. So when you have exploration results from material projects, there's a number of factors, a number of pieces of information you must disclose in the body of the announcement. And these are things like the northing, easting, elevation, dip, azimuths, etc. They're things which people have been disclosing for quite some time, builds really on the existing Clause 17. So none of this stuff is actually new to people who've been making these announcements. If, however, you're not able to disclose your northing and your easting, or you don't know your drill location, God forbid, then you need to explain why you can't do that. we don't expect to see many people explain why they can't give us the information in relation to this. For years we've been asking for this information. People have given it to us when we've got it. Most companies actually comply with this anyway. As I said, this isn't something new. It builds on the old Clause 17 of the JORC Code. So we don't see this as a major change. So that's the first part of it. The second part, though, and this also is repeated, if you like, in the JORC Code, there's also a requirement to release as an attachment to the report a report based on sections 1 and 2 of Table 1 of the JORC Code, and that's to be attached to the back of the market announcement. And obviously that's for the first time it's reported, or if there's any material upgrade to the existing report. And you can report that on an if not, why not basis, so similar to how it's done in the JORC Code. Obviously, if you determine that one of the criteria is not material, you've got to identify that criteria and explain why it's not material. What this is actually saying to you is it's not sufficient to say, spacing's not relevant. You need to say why it's not relevant. So it's actually giving. It's not just saying if not. It's also saying why not. Now I want to talk about mineral resources. This is picked up in Listing Rule 5.8, and you'll start to see the theme developing. So for the disclosure of initial or materially changed estimates, so of a material project, so the trigger points, it's a material project and it's either the initial disclosure or a materially changed to that estimate, there's a requirement to include in the body of the announcement the matters referred to under the dot point there, so geology, sampling technique, analysis, drill techniques. And there's also a requirement to include as an attachment to the report a report based on sections 1 to 3 of Table 1 of the JORC Code, and again prepared on an if not, why not basis. And if you do this, then the next time you report it, you can use the Streamlined Competent Person Statement sign-off, and I'll come to that in a minute. In relation to reserves, again, for disclosure of initial or materially changed estimates of reserves for a material project, you've got to disclose in the body of the announcement information relevant to the 8, I think, or 10 factors. One of those factors is material assumptions. Now, you need to understand Guidance Note 31. You need to get your head around Guidance Note 31 because that deals with the disclosure of commercially sensitive information. So ASX would not usually expect an entity to disclose trade secrets, proprietary mining technology, or metallurgical processes, or commercially sensitive information, for example, pricing or volumes, under long-term contractual commitments. In such cases, though, we say it's okay not to disclose commercially sensitive information, provided you explain why. Firstly, the information has to be actually commercially sensitive. Using the spot price for iron ore is not commercially sensitive. So you need to explain why something is commercially sensitive, but then you've got to disclose sufficient information so that in a narrative, so that investors can understand the methodology used. So you might be able to say pricing without actually giving the price, but it's pursuant to a existing contract. We certainly don't want companies to disclose information which would put them at a competitive disadvantage, and that's why if you look at Guidance Note 31, it talks at length about the steps you can go. And again, in relation to mineral or reserves, you need to include a report based on sections 1 to 4, 5 of Table 1 of the JORC Code. And again, you can use the Streamlined Competent Person sign-off. So you'll see that there's a theme which relates to all of the disclosure of exploration results, resources, and reserves, and that is where it's an initial announcement or initial disclosure or an upgrade of it, and it relates to a commercially sensitive project. There's a number of factors you need to disclose in the body of the announcement, and then as an attachment to the announcement, you need to disclose the relevant information relevant to sections relevant to Table 1. So whether it's sections 1, 2, 3, and 5. I think that's right. 4. Don't see many diamonds here. No. So now I want to talk about the Streamlined Competent Person Statement. So the new rules introduce the concept of a Streamlined Competent Person Statement. So if So when you initially disclose a resource reserve or exploration results, you've got to have it signed off by a competent person. If, however, you want to report it subsequently, that information, provided you have disclosed information in accordance with these listing rules, so you've made all the necessary Table 1 disclosure, then the subsequent disclosure you can rely on the Streamlined Competent Person Statement requirements. And so what that essentially says is, in a subsequent report, you don't have to get a competent person to sign off it again, provided you cross-reference back to the original announcement, and you confirm that the subsequent report, that the company is not aware of any new information or data that materially affects the information included in the market announcement, and in the case of resources or reserves, that all the material assumptions and technical parameters haven't changed, and they continue to apply, and consequently, then you can use the Streamlined Competent Person Statement. Next issue I want to talk about is historical and foreign estimates. This is relatively straightforward. Since 2007, companies have been able to report historical and foreign estimates relying on Companies Update we prepared with JORC. It's Companies Update 1107, and that listed 10 matters you need to disclose against. If you could report on those 10 matters, and sorry, when I say foreign, obviously a non-JORC based, and historicals pre-1989. That's because JORC came into the listing rules. But if you can disclose against those 10 matters, then we would grant a waiver and let you disclose those matters even though it wasn't within the confines of the JORC Code. What we've now done is said, those 10 matters, if you can disclose against them, you don't need to apply to us for a waiver, but you need to be able to disclose against all of those matters, and if you do so, then you can release the foreign or historical estimate. A word of caution though, every time we saw one of these for a waiver application, not every time, but a lot of times we saw these for waiver applications, one of the things they need to disclose against is reliability. Companies that often said, yep, we think this 1957 Kazakh report is entirely reliable. And we would say, why? And they say, well, because we read about it in another report. So, what have you done to determine the reliability of it? So, a word of warning, make sure you are satisfied about the reliability of the information which makes up the report. Production targets and forecast financial information. And I'm lucky that Ivy and Stefan are sitting in the audience who pop up at any time. So, the JORC Code has never dealt with production targets as such. The listing rules have now have prescribed rules that relate to production targets. For quite some time, we were concerned about the basis for some of these production targets. And as a consequence, we took a long look at them with ASIC and with industry, and we came up with a number of rules which we think encapsulate how you should go about reporting production targets and whether or not you have a reasonable basis for actually disclosing the production target in the first instance. So what do we mean by a production target? It's actually a defined term, and it means projection or forecast of the amount of minerals to be extracted from a particular mining tenement. But it also includes the financial information derived from a forecast, such as NPV or internal rates of return. Our rules aren't aimed at production targets being disclosed by operating mines, so they're actually excluded. And the rules don't actually cover aspirational statements. I want to be a global producer of X by Y date. So purely aspirational statements are not caught. So, how the rules work is this: there's a prohibition on disclosing a production target which is based solely on an exploration target. For obvious reasons, an exploration target is quite a significant range. If you're able to talk about the actual production you're going to get off that exploration target, why would you bother even taking it to having a reserve declared? You've got it already. So, a little bit too speculative. And there's also a prohibition if it's solely based on a combination of an inferred mineral resource and an exploration target, and also on historical or foreign estimates. So they're expressed prohibitions. If, however, you do disclose a production target, and that may be where it's based on an ore reserve, and that may include a mineral resource, and it may actually include an inferred resource, and it could include an exploration target, then there's a number of rules. And the reason you'll note the prohibitions are where it's solely based on an inferred and an exploration target, or solely based on an exploration target. So if you have a combination of a reserve resource and a exploration target, you may be able to disclose it, provided you comply with particular rules. And that is, you've got to disclose all the material assumptions, you've got to have the underlying mineralisation signed off by a CP, and you've got to disclose the relative proportions of the ore reserve, mineral resource, or exploration potential that underpin the target. But where it includes an inferred resource or an exploration target, then you've got to have particular cautionary statements in relation to approximate cautionary statements included. So what we're looking for is the disclosure of the material assumptions. If, however, it's based solely on an inferred mineral resource, so remember I said prohibition if it's an exploration target or exploration target and a inferred resource. So where it's based solely on an inferred mineral resource, we consulted quite widely on this, and it came back to us that there are some exceptional circumstances where you may in fact be able to disclose a production target which is based solely on an inferred mineral resource. But if you are going to do that, then there's a number of things you've got to do, and that is you've got to disclose the basis for the target and the level of confidence. You've got to complete a technical report, and it's got to be publicly released, and that has to be prepared by a competent person, an independent competent person, and there's necessary cautionary statements which go with it. You need to look at our guidance note 31, because that actually addresses some of the exceptional circumstances where it may be appropriate to talk about a production target based on an inferred resource. I'm sure this will come up as an issue though in the panel discussion, so happy to come back and deal with that then. Now, cautionary statements. So for production targets, you've got to have a cautionary statement. For historical estimates, you must have cautionary statements. Indeed, for exploration targets, you've got to have a cautionary statement. It's got to be proximate, so it's got to be on the same page, same paragraph, or immediately preceding. We're not going to tolerate seeing cautionary statements in small point after the competent person statement on the last page of the announcement when the production target or the exploration target is highlighted on the very first page. It has to be proximate, so you can't footnote it. It must be given equal prominence, so same font, size and colour as the relevant information. And you note that the JORC Code itself says you can't put one in a heading anymore. Go that way. And also we introduced the requirements for annual disclosure. So this is where we look for the results of your annual review of your resources and estimates, and we ask you to aggregate them by commodity, geographical area, and more importantly ask for a comparison for the previous year, explaining any material changes. And importantly, there's a summary of your governance arrangements and your internal controls. How do you go about what's the audit process? How do you go about you're ensuring that your resource estimates are of sufficient quality? Now, the transition. So, obviously, when this presentation is one very similar to one I did in April, and probably done every week since then. But we've added this new slide because since then, and you may recall, we asked people who've had any questions to send us an email to resources and reporting, resource and reporting FAQ at asx.com.au. Out of that, just to show that we were listening, we prepared the FAQs, and they deal with things such as the transition for the new disclosure rules. And that talks about, when you, the transition one talks about, if you have an existing resource reported on 2004, you can continue to report it post-transition, which is 1 December, as a 2004 report. You can't hold out that it's prepared under 2012 because, frankly, it's not. It doesn't have the necessary disclosure requirements under Table 1. So we talk about how they're effectively grandfathered across until such time as there is a material change or upgrade. We talk about, again, we give great explanation in relation to material projects. I think you've made these available on your website. Yeah, so all of these FAQs are on our website. And there's a link from the JORC website. You'll find them very helpful. It's a fluid document, so we're happy to take further questions. We talk about how you should be preparing yourself for the transition, which is imminently around the corner. We talk about the requirement for a pre-feasibility study, a study at pre-feasibility level to declare for a reserve, and that must be in place by 1 December 2014. We talk at length about the competent person statements and the streamlining. For those of you who've read the JORC Code in depth and the ASX Listing Rules in depth, you'll see that there is a slight anomaly here. Under the JORC Code, you can actually streamline your competent person statement, which is all well and good, but under the Listing Rules, you can't. For those of you who work for entities which are listed, you cannot streamline your competent person statement unless you have complied and reported in accordance with Listing Rules 5.8, 5.7, 5.8 and 5.9. So if you report all of that information, then you have the benefit of the streamlining competent person statement. We talk about what should be disclosed in relation to conflicts of interest. You notice under the JORC Code there's a requirement now that potential conflicts of interest should be disclosed by the CP. We deal at length with exploration targets. For quite some time we've been looking each year at the items which are constantly tripped up what we call a breach of the JORC Code. Exploration targets are at the top of the tree. So we've done quite a bit of work in relation to what you need to disclose in relation to exploration targets. Most of this is just a reiteration of what's required under the JORC Code. We make it apparent that you don't actually need to have a Table 1 for reporting an exploration target. But if you report the basis of your exploration target, which is drill results, well, they've got to have the Table 1. So it's sort of picked up that way. And we also talk about whether or not an exploration target, whether or not you can include an exploration target mineralisation that has no prospects of eventual economic extraction as a mineral resource. And the answer is no, you can't. A resource 12 kilometres below the ground, probably an exploration target 12 kilometres below the ground probably isn't going to make it, okay? We say the transition's by 1 December. There's been quite a number of companies which have early adopted. Now, just in relation to the early adoption, it's on a project-by-project basis. If you report one project in accordance with 2012, that doesn't mean you have to report all of your projects in relation to 2012. It's on a project-by-project basis. It also means if you report one project under 2012, that doesn't give you the benefit of the streamlining for your projects which you haven't done that under. Okay, so it's on a project-by-project basis. And you need to note that the one for the pre-feasibility study estimate, pre-feasibility level study for a reserve, that comes into effect on 1 December 2014.